to embrace change, cope, adapt, and prosper with stresses and disturbances that are a result of unpredictable climate impacts. I don't know whether that's controversial, but you can tell me in the discussion. So let me just say right at the outset that I'm going to posit to you that human behavioral approaches present the opportunity to think differently about how communities are engaged and motivated, and to thereby create the conditions necessary to embrace change, cope, adapt, and prosper in the face of climatic changes and stochastic weather events. In our field, these approaches have been focused mostly on natural resource conservation and management specifically. But everything, of course, is happening in the context of climate change. And so what we're finding experientially is that in many cases, and particularly when a severe weather event occurs, they're supportive of these elements that promote resilience in pretty profound ways. So this is especially true around a few things: increasing the readiness, which reflects both awareness and willingness with which a community approaches the need to adapt, the level of trust within and between groups to engage in the cooperation needed to quickly and effectively adapt, and institutions that exist to facilitate effective and rapid decision-making. Before we get too specific on that, I want to just take a little step back. I think the key questions that we're all thinking about, if there are more, we can talk about them, in this context are, given the reality of climate change and the long-term shifts and stochastic shocks stemming from it, how do we create less vulnerable, more resilient communities? In particular, behaviors have to change and what new behaviors have to be adopted. Certainly there are other things that have to change that don't directly. But behavioral approaches, everything has to change to increase resilience in communities. So therefore, what strategies do we have at our fingertips to drive these changes? So let's look at this last question. I like to say that most approaches to conservation, natural resource management throughout at least modern history tend to come down to a simple choice: carrot or stick, money and punishment. How do we tweak extrinsic, largely material incentives to provoke a calculated response in a utility maximizing individual decision maker in favor of a pro-environmental outcome? So if the whole world looks like this guy, we'd be in great shape. We like to call this Homo economicus, a term that people are probably familiar with. I apologize to Trekkies in the room. This is probably completely unfair to Spock. But the point is to highlight the prevailing assumption that humans are consistently rational and narrowly self-interested agents who possess complete information at all times to evaluate options and maximize their individual outcomes as a function of utility. If there are any economists, that will make complete sense. But what if human nature tell us about the way humans really make decisions, get motivated, and work together? The bottom line is that Homo economicus is a ruse. So I don't want to dwell too long on everything we know to substantiate that, but I do want to highlight, because it's relevant to the conversation, that all of these are oriented around the fundamental belief that we know from disciplines ranging from evolutionary theory and political science to social psychology and, more recently, behavioral economics, that people are essentially social animals. And this offers us a few key insights about the way that people are motivated. So we know that, contrary to what we've been led to believe, people are natural cooperators, and given the right conditions, they're much more predisposed toward cooperation than competition. And that's an important insight because it's not really working in an uphill battle, as it were, to somehow get a bunch of inherently competitive individuals to somehow or another act in their collective interest, in this case to adapt to climate change. Emotions like pride are incredibly powerful motivators. If you're not stuck, you care a lot about emotions, social connections, things like that, sometimes much more than you care about money. And people tend to be a lot more motivated by positive emotions, like the experience of pride, say negative emotions having to do with shame or fear. So if we give people something to be proud of, a positive way to proactively improve their resilience through cooperation, they're going to thrive. Really, the notion here, emotions are powerful. Take a particular interest in positive emotions like pride. We know that word of mouth, social interaction, interpersonal communication, whatever you want to call it, is the secret sauce to how social norms are spread. Only by interacting amongst each other can groups establish, strengthen, change, and communicate social norms. So just by bringing people together, you're creating the conditions for cooperation. Last thing, people might be familiar with this picture. I'll give you a second to take it in. We know that context matters. The context in which a decision is made matters as much as the choices that we're deciding between. Here's a really good example. If you haven't picked up on it, these are people who are going to work out at a gym, and they're taking an escalator there to get there. Why on earth would you take an escalator into the gym? Why would you go to the gym? Because we're human. So, does a behavioral lens help us better understand and then work for conservation or social resilience? Do we have more than just the carrot and the stick at our disposal to address these questions, or is that really all that we have to choose between? Well, at RARE, we're working to use these insights to change the way that people relate to nature and to upend the outdated, frankly, outdated assumptions to only the carrot and stick. So, how does this come together into something different? What does this sort of approach, one that accounts for human behavior and decision-making, actually look like in practice? Behavioral approaches incorporate fields like social marketing, social and behavior change communications, and behavioral economics to apply a holistic understanding of human motivation and decision-making, and an in-depth engagement and diagnosis of a specific target audience to deploy strategies that promote positive behaviors or social norms which are supportive of a social goal. And the example that I can share with you, although there are many, is the signature method of the organization that I come from, RARE, which is called a pride campaign. And the fundamental concept is, rather than relying on negative incentives like fines or imprisonment, or only positive incentives like rewards or pay for performance, all of which have their place as incentives and are often complementary, a pride campaign focuses primarily on inspiring a community to change social norms around how its natural resources are used in everyday life. So that essential logic has been repeated in community-level pride campaigns more than 300 times now. And I think the official count is up to 57 countries. And in all these places, the approach basically starts with the same theory. So let's break it down a bit and understand how this translates the features of understanding human behavior, motivation, and decision-making into a tactical methodology for promoting adoption of a new behavioral norm. So it really starts with one hypothesis, that conservation is fundamentally a behavioral problem. So the premise is that conservation outcomes, whether those outcomes are related to species population or habitat quality or preservation of a natural resource base, are achieved by reducing existing threats, such as overfishing or habitat destruction. And those threats are reduced by replacing them with new, more sustainable behavioral norms. So this is followed by a second hypothesis, namely that a behavioral approach, in this case a pride campaign, can successfully promote the new behavioral norm against the target audience such that those conservation outcomes are ultimately achieved. So the Pride campaign starts with the assumption that knowledge is often a necessary but almost never a sufficient condition for change. So there's a certain level of knowledge that can be raised within the audience, and we find that usually the most important types of knowledge are those having to do with knowledge of the solution or the norm itself, and not of the ecological problem, which is so often the focus of environmental messages. A Pride campaign also focuses intently on attitudes, in particular on promoting positive attitudes that are supportive of the new norm. Often that means identifying and understanding existing shared values within the group and allowing the group to form attitudes about how those to the behavioral solution. The next element should come as no surprise. As I said before, word of mouth is where the magic happens. This is how social norms diffuse through a group, and research across virtually all the behavioral and social sciences and beyond has demonstrated that where interpersonal communication, social interaction, and group identity intersect, cooperation occurs. We also know that context matters, and so we have to go beyond simply inspiring a desire to adopt a new behavioral norm, actually creating the enabling conditions in which that behavior can occur. So we call this, in our methodology, barrier removal, sometimes pronounced as barrier removal. This is highly dependent on the circumstances, but it can involve things like technical capacity. It's great to promote the use of fuel-efficient stoves, but if you don't know how to use or prepare them, that's kind of a non-starter. Or infrastructural needs, you need buoy markers in the water to know where you're not supposed to fish, or even policy change that creates the right enabling conditions. So when you get these things right, adoption of a new behavioral norm becomes much easier. I should say there's a tendency to think of these things as linear, just because of the way that they're visually represented, but that's not the case. For instance, people often talk about things that they know nothing about. We saw that last night. And they often form attitudes based on their interaction with their social group, and not necessarily the other way around. So there's a lot of interaction between these elements, and the algebra here is mostly heuristic. Okay, so how does this work in practice? So let's travel quickly to the small community of Pilar in the Camotes Islands in the Cebu province of the central Philippines. It's roughly where that circle is, but if there are any experts on the Philippines in the room, I probably didn't get it quite right. And first partner, the local government unit of Pilar, and their campaign operative, whose name is Susan Catelo, they started working with RARE in 2012 to improve the effectiveness of the Pilar Municipal Marine Park. It's about a 180-acre nearshore reserve consisting of coral, seagrass, and mangrove habitat, and they established it in 2005. But it's been, relatively successful at times, but always suffering from the classic challenges of fisher intrusion into designated no-take areas and usage of illegal destructive gear. So Susan and her team, under RARE's mentorship, set out to implement a Pride campaign that would change these norms around the marine sanctuary, and the logic was pretty simple. In order to increase the abundance of fish in the marine park, they'd need to reduce intrusions into no-take areas and eliminate the use of destructive fishing nets. So they'd need to get the community of fishers more involved in patrolling and enforcing social norms around the sanctuary regulations, but more importantly, they need to create a culture of compliance amongst the fishers. And to do this, they employed the simple Pride methodology. They improved knowledge of the sanctuary and its ability to protect the fish resource base, promote pride in the marine environment, and social value of participation in marine stewardship. They promote conversations about the benefits of the marine sanctuary and responsibility to protect it. And that context, that enabling context barrier removal part, was mostly focused around installing sinkers, marker buoys, and guardhouses, and training community patrol units. So Susan conducted extensive target audience research, engaged in diagnosis of her audience, of prevailing social norms and shared values and barriers to change, many of the things that we've already talked about. And with that knowledge, she rolled out a fully branded marketing and behavior change campaign targeted toward increasing knowledge of the solution, putting positive normative attitudes, and stimulating interpersonal communication and social interaction. You can see some evidence here which speaks for itself. Here's a photo of the, these are the sinkers that they set out to place the marker buoys. And here's a small snapshot of what happened. Her efforts and her organization's efforts, the municipal government, and the monitoring are ongoing. But here's just a little snapshot. So knowledge at the site, and in this case, this is just one indicator of knowledge, but the percentage of fishers who know the benefits of having a no-take area was already really high. So she really needed to just maintain that. That wasn't a big area of focus for her. More work needed to be done to change attitudes about fishing inside the no-take area. We call these normative attitudes, attitudes about what we should do. And she saw a dramatic shift after only about, I think it was about 18 months. The number of reported sightings in the marine park reduced significantly, and early indicators of fish biomass in the reserve shows that it has almost doubled. Now, this is very early data. It takes a long time for indicators like fish biomass to respond, and these are based on underwater transects. So there's a lot more measurement that has to happen, but good signs. So that's great. But what does all this have to do with social resilience? Well, there's a part of the campaign story. I'm trying my best not to cough. She started her efforts in 2012 to engage with local fishers to improve compliance and enforcement. The island looked like this, in spite of course, a heavily depleted fishery and decimated underwater habitat. And it was in this context that she launched her social marketing and behavior change campaign to inspire the fishers of Pilar to take pride in their beautiful island and its rich marine resources, and to realize the potential of cooperating and working together to sustainably manage the marine resource. And then about a year in November 2013, this happened. Does anybody remember in November 2013? This Typhoon Haiyan. I think in the Philippines it was called Yolanda. And I don't think that Pilar was precisely ground zero, but I think it was pretty darn close. So that brought one of the deadliest and most destructive natural disasters ever to hit the Philippines, and really the region. And the whole region was decimated. It wasn't even clear whether it would make sense for Susan, about a year in, to continue her campaign in the midst of such devastation. But instead, she shifted gears and used the typhoon as an opportunity. She engaged the fishers and community members in beach cleanups and leveraged the fact that the community was now keenly aware of threats to their resources. So more than ever at this point, they were eager for a way to protect their marine resources, and Susan could honestly tell them that the thriving underwater habitat is the best way to withstand future shocks. And they had already been building trust and institutions to come together, deal with the disaster, move forward. So it's not a stretch to say that partly as a result of Susan's ongoing campaign, they had the readiness, trust, and institutions for decision-making that enabled a more resilient response. Not only did they have an existing solution that they were already working toward to build ecological resilience, they now had the necessary elements in place, or improvements to the necessary elements, to embrace change, cope, adapt, and prosper in the face of a totally devastating weather event. tell you one more story like this. This one comes from San Vicente de Chucuri in Colombia, about 250 miles northeast of Bogota, where the nonprofit Natura Colombia and their campaign operative, Claudia Céspedes, was working with the municipal government in San Vicente to establish a program of watershed agreements to protect the downstream water supply. I won't spend too much time, but just a quick explanation is that these more or less follow the logic of water users make voluntary mechanism that incentivizes conservation and generally improved agricultural practices amongst farmers upstream in the watershed. They're somewhat unique in that the watershed agreements leverage traditional norms of risk sharing and reciprocity. They involve non-cash, in-kind type payments, non-monetary payments, and focus on local institutions and social contracts. We can talk more about how those work if people are interested, but that's the basic intuition. So Claudia was engaging with upstream landowners, farmers, and ranchers through workshops, visits, and interviews to begin to promote adoption of practices like riparian buffers, silvopasture, agroforestry, and more. They could agree to these things to improve their productivity and the ecological resilience of their farms. And because it also benefits water users downstream, those users would help support them in implementing new practices, funding, materials, and training. So several months in to her campaign, but really before it had gotten massively underway on the marketing campaign side, in May of 2011, a massive landslide wiped out much of the town and a lot of the riverside land all along the watershed. It was really an emergency situation. And so again, it wasn't clear whether Claudia could or should continue her campaign. But because of the work that she'd already done after the landslide, the landowners actually began reaching out to Claudia and said, all this that you've been saying to us, now we need it even more. We have to start over, but we can do it right this time. So now they really got it. So Claudia repositioned and went to work. And in less than a year, they had nearly 1,200 hectares under new reciprocal agreement contracts, either under improved agricultural practices, for the most part, or in conservation. And her campaign has been one of the most successful watershed agreement campaigns that RARE has been a part of. It's anecdotal, but she says that it really had a major effect on the readiness of the farmers to engage in these improvement practices. She was working to get them to start talking to each other to build trust, both within the upstream farmers and rancher groups, within the groups of downstream users, but also across. So to build that trust between the upstream and downstream audiences. And to improve institutions for collective decision making. So similar story. So again, it's all great, but how do we measure this effect? So our teams collect lots of data to measure the shifts in knowledge, attitudes, and practices at Pride campaign sites. But at this point, this resilience narrative is mostly anecdotal. So naturally, we're interested in how we can systematically begin to measure this effect. And there are also ways that our teams are piloting to adapt our existing monitoring systems to incorporate and account for adaptation, and learn how we can do an even better job of engineering the intervention to maximize that effect. So I just want to share an example from our Colombia team who are piloting an adaptive capacity index geared toward assessing this along several dimensions having to do with socioeconomic, socio-institutional, and socio-ecological factors, plus added dimensions of food security and satisfied basic needs. So they've now applied this as a baseline measure at a new set of 7 sites in Colombia's Valle de Cauca, also working to establish watershed agreement with those sites, and a first set of follow-up monitoring is underway. So this is what it looks like at the baseline. And it would be crazy for me to try to get into all the mechanics of the index right now, but and I also am not the one who designed it. But here's an example of what the sort of indicators underneath this look like, having to do with some of the things we've already been talking about vis-a-vis social capital. So these survey questions, I'm not going to read it all to you, but survey questions are indexed to create an overarching social capital measure, which is then built into the socio-institutional component of the framework, so it kind of rolls up. But you can see that it's grounded in a lot of these questions about things that are very relevant to what we've been talking about, what I've been talking about. I haven't said anything yet. And here's some preliminary data of what changes they're observing at the 7 sites. This is all very preliminary. This first monitoring phase only included 40 surveys. Take a maximum of 40 surveys at each site. So, but there's a lot underway, and it's exciting to think about ways that we can begin to measure and test these assumptions about how behavioral approaches to natural resource conservation and management, like pride, can help us build community resilience. So, thanks. And I suppose now we go to discussion, when you can tell me everything I got wrong.
Thank you, Kevin. And before we start taking questions, I wanted to note that we have Kate from Nexus Media, is that correct? Is filming this, and it will go on livestream.com. Oh, okay, so it'll go on livestream.com. If you don't want to be filmed, can they ask you not to, to stop? And then for the webinar and for this, if you wouldn't mind, you have a question, tell us who you are and your affiliation. And with that, I'll turn it over to all of you. Do you want me to?
I'm happy to. Okay. It's up to you. Okay.
So, questions for Kevin?
So I just need to stay close to that.
I have kind of a lighthearted one to kick things off. I'm Rebecca Carter, and I'm with the World Resources Institute, but previously I was with USAID posted in the Philippines, and in my capacity there, I signed off on a 6-foot-tall blue duck costume that was part of a rare project. And I noticed throughout the presentation we kept seeing the mascots. Could you talk a little bit about the role of them? And
Sure, yeah. So mascots tend to be, I think for good reasons, the first thing that people remember or identify about pride campaigns. And I think that's great because they're really symbolic of the whole underlying philosophy of pride campaigns, which is promoting this sort of positive message about empowering communities of resource users to actually proudly take control of their resource base and manage it the way that they want to. And so that can vary. You know, sometimes mascots are, campaigns are more focused on, not as much nowadays, but are more focused on species, saving a particular species, particular charismatic species. Those are really easy ones because you just make a mascot. But nowadays, they're much more often about protecting natural resource bases for not only the sake of conservation, but for livelihoods and things. And so that's a much more open process of sort of determining what mascot best represents a campaign, but the idea is to be really that ambassador for the whole message of the campaign. So yeah, it's interesting to see how, I mean, you want there to be community co-creation, so communities are generally involved in choosing the mascot, but it comes to interesting questions like if say a fishing campaign, do you want the mascot to be the primary fish that's taken out of the fishery because it's super relevant to the campaign, But then what if, like the kids fall in love with this fish and then don't want to eat it? I mean, that's totally anecdotal, but yeah, does that even answer the question? Let's talk about mascots. Let's keep talking about mascots. This is Nikki, who is our senior manager of global development, is here to give better answers to questions.
No, I was just going to say that one interesting thing about mascots, speaking of the fishing campaigns, and if you knew us in the Philippines, we actually have our first, at one of our current campaigns in the Philippines, they decided to have two mascots, and one of them, I don't even know, I think it's some kind of fish, and the other one is our first ever human mascot. So they've chosen to have a fisher as one of the mascots. So it's a fisher who goes around, it's a cartoony looking costume, same thing, and they go around sort of promoting the fishing behaviors. So pretty neat.
We have another, I see Ben in the room here, who I haven't seen in a few years, but he was out for a little while and did a lot of investigation of our history with mascots, so they have stories to share as well. We've had like clams, cacti, really ugly things that you would think can't be charismatic, but if you put big eyes on it, yeah, right.
So, John, and just everybody remember, I think this is not amplified in the room. It's just for online, so also speak up.
Thanks, John. Very good. Is this on?
It's not in the room.
Okay. All right. John Magistrate, Counterpart International. Could you speak a little more specifically to the initial phase of sort of knowledge and attitudes and how you, methodologically or whatever, how you really engage in that process to identify knowledge and attitudes? The reason I ask is because my experience over the years has been that when I look at particularly environmental issues, whether it's a climate stress or shock that's involved or not, what I've found over time, at least where I've worked mostly in Africa, is that there's this confluence of multiple factors that are drivers. It's not one, it's not two. When you look at barriers or do a barrier analysis, I find it can become quite complex because you have certain barriers that may be something you could target short term, particularly economic behaviors. People engage in, severe poverty. People will go out and cut a tree, even though they may be aware of the impact or the effect of that. If you're desperate and you're living on $1 or $2 a day, you may go out and cut that tree regardless because you've got to feed a family or you've got to get by. Then you have other intersecting kinds of variables that look at deeply ingrained cultural attitudes or views toward the environment that may have to do with survival because of a particular animal that threatens your crop or your family, or a religious view perhaps that is grounded in fatalism. So when you get a sort of this basket of complexity of drivers and attitudes, how do you work with that? Did you encounter that? Because some can be short-term economic incentives that you can address, but then you have maybe longer-term cultural factors that you're really not going to address them in a short time frame. So I'm just curious to know about that.
And a mascot.
Yeah, let's go back to talking about mascots. Yeah, so I think the shortest response would be that I agree it's really complicated. It's much more complicated than, for example, a theory of adding up 4 things to achieve behavior change can possibly depict. And so it's a balance of recognizing that we need to have a tool and a starting point, and that there's a certain irreducible complexity to, gosh, I don't even know what we'd call it, human behavior, human emotion. So I think the first part of your question was more about how we actually operationalize these knowledge and attitude and interpersonal communication components, given that complexity. And at the most basic level, it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, months and months before a campaign is even designed, let alone started. The campaign team engages in target audience research, using in-depth interviews and focus groups and surveys to really understand we can put specific knowledge factors up, but really the richness comes from understanding that much more complicated story that you're talking about that has to do with the shared values and needs and context of how the community of resource users is engaging with the particular resource that we're interested in. And so, you try to paint a picture of what that is, and then really engage those resource users themselves, key stakeholders, influencers. There's a lot of audience segmentation that goes on to engage the behaviors in the co-creation of the campaign and of the strategy. Yeah, let's have some drinks and maybe I'll have better answers. But yeah.
Yeah, so we have a question from online, which is from Luis Ramos at USAID El Salvador. The question is, what is the key element or elements the PRIDE approach is different from all the other behavioral change approaches mentioned, such as social marketing or other conservation behavior change proposals? Sorry, I struggled with that.
So it's not mutually exclusive. PRIDE can incorporate any of those elements from social marketing and traditional behavior communications from like public health and even behavioral economics. I mean, that notion of context matters is now operationalized mostly in behavioral economics, although it's been part of social psychology for a long time. I think to spin the question a little bit to what stands out or makes it unique, it's really, I mean, it's in the name. PRIDE campaigns are focused very deliberately on, as I said, promoting positive messages about the empowerment of the community of resources to take pride in their ability to manage their resource sustainably in the local environment. Those things were different back when we were working on species conservation campaigns, and you have like an endemic, super charismatic species that anybody in their right mind would be really proud to have in their community. So now where you're talking about a lot more messages around the empowerment of a group to work together and cooperate to manage something that's really the fabric of their everyday life. And so I think that that's a unique feature in that so much in environmental programs, in climate change, we're focused on negative messages, doom and gloom. We're all screwed if we don't fix this. And by and large, people are people, and they often are not motivated by those things. It's just the way it is. Now there are, certain elements of loss that people are really motivated by, loss aversion. But generally, give someone something to be proud of, something to take ownership of, something to feel positive about, and they're going to be a lot more proactive. So I think that kind of answers the question.
This is the first episode of this thing we're doing in here. And that first one, this side of the room was kind of dark, and nobody spoke, and this side was very active. So we want to call out you guys.
Thank you. I'm Charlotte Germain. I'm a AAAS fellow at USAID. And I was wondering, how do you deal with areas of conflict, either based around ethnic origin or based around activity, sector of activity? If you're doing a program in one sector of activity and you're kind of maybe creating conflict with communities that work in other sectors.
Right. So there's no easy answer to that one either. Thanks. Does anybody want to talk about mascots again? So I guess I could say a couple things about that. One, you know, I don't want to say something that I don't know to be true, but I do know that anecdotally we experience a lot in places where there has been conflict, maybe not violent conflict, but mistrust between local institutions and the public or specific communities of resource users. By engaging in the sort of things that are, I mean, it almost seems impossible that it would be this simple, but by engaging in the sort of things that are part of Pride campaigns, like public parades and events in which the people come together in these really positive ways, oftentimes authorities sort of follow because they're seeing the public support. So there's a certain amount of conflict resolution where there's that level of mistrust. Now, I think you're talking about something a little bit different. And I would say that probably our most relevant experience with this has to do with our work in small-scale fisheries, where, especially in our more recent programs, we're working to help communities in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Brazil, and Mozambique primarily to establish new management regimes in their fisheries, rights-based management regimes, so that the communities where the fisheries occur or exist are the ones that have ownership over that. And that involves excluding people who may have only been fishing in those areas. And so that's an open question. I don't have an answer to that, but yes. Yeah, more beers. Yes.
So, my name is Kelly Claiborne. I am currently interning at WWF, and I'm doing things on the social impacts of marine protected areas in Indonesia. So I've been to Indonesia before as a volunteer for a conservation research company, and I came across the same thing where a newly, well, I'm not sure actually how new, but an established MPA, there were multiple ethnicities within the MPA that had different traditions of resource use and cultural norms around the resource use. And so it created a lot of issue about who can create ownership and the structure. But my question actually is, it's kind of, I mean, it's all related, but the mascot, I'll get to the mascot. I'm from Columbus, Ohio originally, and did my master's thesis on well-being and consumption and the interplay between ecological footprint and well-being in Columbus, and our kind of network was through the Columbus Neighborhood Pride program. And their mascot, it's called Columbus Neighborhood Pride. So they have a neighborhood pride program, and their mascot was a life-size cardboard cutout of our mayor. And people loved posing with Mayor Coleman, and it was really exciting for everybody. And so that was actually how they would reach out, and they would do a bike ride, a neighborhood bike ride with the mayor, and there's 4 or 5 neighborhood pride weeks every year. And so that was kind of our way to access different neighborhoods and talk with people. And one of the findings that we had, which makes me think about this, is that when we looked at well-being and ecological footprint in one kind of well-to-do neighborhood that has a really strong identity and sense of self versus one that doesn't have a very strong sense of identity, we found that the one with a less strong sense of identity actually kind of was a buffer for well-being, and it made me think about community psychology and about how maybe if you build an identity around sense of place as opposed to sense of like attributes of the people who live there, and you build up, this is where we live on the east side of Columbus, and this is our street, or whatever, you build it around place, then it actually might create a better sense of cohesion and pride, and so that could potentially deter some of those ethnic and conflicts that happen. So I just wanted to share some like Columbus U.S. pride programs that are, I guess.
That's a really good point. A pride of place is, one of the most fundamental forms of pride I think we can feel. I mean, look at the Olympics. You just have to come from the same country. I mean, we can be so divided in an election season, and yet, powerful. Thanks.
One more online, and I'll come back over to the side of there.
So this is from Skylar Olson from IRG. How do you use the pride approach to address threats to conservation that are outside of the control of local communities, such as powerful corporations or state-sponsored activities that can undermine conservation efforts?
There are a lot of other organizations who are working on those. I'm just going to look at you, Flora, like you asked the question, who are working on those sort of things. We have traditionally focused, you could call it like the supply side, communities of resource users where that resources and the threats to those resources are like the fabric of everyday life. So it's become more relevant recently in some of the small-scale fisheries work where the sort of policy framework of the country might have a profound effect on whether or not a fishing community can actually manage its fishery, and that differs across the countries in which we're working. Nikki probably knows more about that than I do.
Short answer, and yeah, I think the fisheries work, our fisheries work is a good example of that. We have chosen to focus on specifically small-scale fisheries and not industrial, basically for that reason, because the particular approach that we have honed is very community oriented. That said, what Kevin is saying is true. So there's I think that the threat is within the community, but some of the barriers are larger than that, and so that we have, we work at larger levels than just the community, but the pride piece stays at the community level. We've also through one of the Bloomberg Philanthropies investments, we are also sort of working with Oceana, who focuses at the industrial. So we work together and we coordinate, but we are more on the small scale side, and we work with others to do larger.
Hi, my name is Jenny Kane, and I work on climate change capacity building at USAID. And I have a question about RARE's theory of change. I was interested, given the role of self-efficacy in behavior change and how important that is, that it's not pulled out as one of the four that are highlighted. And so I was curious to hear a bit more about where self-efficacy is considered. Is it primarily in the removal of barriers, or is RARE's approach a bit different because a lot of behaviors are around things you don't do, like you don't take more fish or you don't deforest?
It's hard to reflect the meat of the approach in just a theory of change. So in a lot of our curriculum in which we train our partners how to do these programs, the self-efficacy component, self-efficacy is about sort of the belief in your actual ability to do what it is that you're being asked to do, for simplified definition, but that appears in, particularly in the attitudes. So as we work with partners to develop messages in a campaign, oftentimes self-efficacy is a big part of that. Self-efficacy can also be driven by things like interpersonal communication, identifying those key influencers who are, in this case, the positive deviants who are doing a particular behavior and getting them to speak more. mascots can promote self-efficacy by demonstrating. This often happens by actually demonstrating the behavior that you're trying to promote. And so it's self-efficacy that appears in that sort of categorical theory of change just because of the nature of what it is. But it's, I mean, it's certainly an important theme throughout. Does that kind of answer? Thank you.
Institute's climate resilience practice. I hope everyone can hear me. And thank you for your presentation. As we saw from the anecdotes and probably human history in general, we're always reacting to disasters and to everything. So my question is more about, are you doing any work on behavioral change or changing mindsets into a more like resilient or like default mindset instead of this, like we're always like in this reactionary mode? So is there any work to, around that or not?
You mean in the context of climate change? We've done a little bit of work, particularly in the Watershed agreement campaigns, which we've done some throughout the northern tropical Andes, and now we're focusing mostly in Colombia, with incorporating elements of, and actually this is true in some of the fisheries campaigns too, of climate change to the extent that it's a message that resonates with the community. I think in Claudia's campaign, she was already talking about the need for these improved agricultural practices in order to build the ecological resilience of the farms. I mean, she was literally talking about how susceptible they were to erosion because of the ranching practices that they were. And so when the landslide happened,
mindset before the disaster strikes. So how do we motivate people or bring more behavioral change before disaster strikes?
Yeah, good question. Got any ideas?
So I'm Chris Perrine. I'm the chief of party for Atlas. I mean, I take your point, but my perspective is sort of the inverse. It's, to me, the way these campaigns seem to be formulated is to provide long-term resilience. And in the two examples that Kevin provided, you know, it was really happenstance that these two you know, disasters occurred, you know, during the course of the campaigns that may have, you know, sort of galvanized attitudes, as I understand it, toward the campaign. But the campaigns were actually formulated prior to those events and with an eye toward creating long-term resiliency in both cases. Not necessarily resiliency to climate change, more resiliency, as I understand, in the context of, you know, long-term sustainable management of the local resources, which, as we all know, in the climate change space, often overlap to a very high degree with creating, you know, long-term resiliency in particular geographic areas and for particular communities.
Is there anybody else on this side?
Benjamin Dills, Wilson Center. So I'm curious if over the years RARE has had to iterate on its theory of change much, particularly as you've shifted from species conservation over to community resource management and resilience. Have there been big epiphanies that have happened, and if so, what prompted them?
Yeah. I'm tempted to go into the extra slides, but I'm not going to do that. So, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I guess maybe the best answer to that question is yes. Because of all, I mean, we're talking about over 300 campaigns in over 50 countries. It's a ridiculous amount of experience for which we have a fair amount of data. And so aside from all of the sort of qualitative learning experiences that we iterate on all the time to improve the methodology, a couple years ago, a team of us took all the social survey data, the CAP survey data, which you know all about, from 84 campaigns. So what is that? Roughly a quarter of all the campaigns over a period of about 5 years from I think it was 18 different countries. So aggregated a whole bunch of data, hundreds of thousands of data points, and kind of did this. I wasn't the statistician, but this sort of meta regression to evaluate changes along that theory of change, but more importantly to evaluate the actual quality of the model. And what we did was we created a bunch of different models. This is maybe getting a little bit wonky, but a bunch of different versions of, will I ever get there? This, and particularly this, the behavioral model. We took elements out, we moved some around, we actually redefined, so we disaggregated the knowledge and attitude and interpersonal communication data and actually defined categories within those. So this gets to the self-efficacy question too. We looked at questions and indicators where we actually have attitudes about self-efficacy, or what we call normative attitudes, which are, like I said before, attitudes about what people in the community should be doing. We disaggregated knowledge into things like knowledge about the local ecology, knowledge about the threats to the resource, knowledge about the solution. And so we could do a lot of stuff that someone smarter than me figured out how to do statistically to create a bunch of different models, throw the data at them, and essentially see how well the data fit the models. And so we learned a ton of interesting stuff from that. One of the cool things, we took IC out of the model and to see how well the data that remained could explain the behavior changes. If this isn't making sense, just trust me. It fell apart. So basically what we learned, the upshot is, we learned that IC is, we already had a hunch, is an incredibly important component of the model. Certainly more so than knowledge. We played with the order in which they occur and found that actually, in spite of what you think, because it's linear, or it appears to be linear, attitudes were much more heavily influenced by IC, by communication, than the other way around. So we had this assumption that you get people to internalize certain attitudes, and then they go out into their peer groups, and they essentially validate those attitudes with their peers and their families before they actually commit to undertaking the new behavior. Maybe this is obvious in hindsight, but I don't think it was obvious before, although there's certainly research outside of ours that supports this. Much more common is that people go and engage in their, this seems super obvious, but they go and engage in their social groups, and then they formulate attitudes based on the social norms that they observe. And these are seemingly trivial, but actually incredibly important to how we understand how behavior change works. And so now we're looking at a lot more of the science that explains the mechanisms behind these phenomena so that we can understand how better to use those. I tried to give a not too complicated answer.
My name is Sajad Haider. I'm a renewable energy practitioner from Pakistan. I just wanted to actually go back to the discussion that was taking place earlier. In the two examples that you gave, natural disasters seem to have pushed the interpersonal communication or the behavioral change to occur rather quickly, and we saw those in the initial results that you were mentioning. How do those compare to some of the other projects that are taking place in the other 57 countries? Do you feel the natural disasters were well, they were sort of a benefit in terms of the particular programs, but have you seen similar results in some of the other programs without such pushes?
Good question. So, yeah, certainly you're sort of, it begs the question when you talk about how, when you look at how the natural disaster, you're like, wow, they sort of galvanized support behind the campaign, and you know, if we start trying to explain success based on them, you're like, well, should we just have natural disasters everywhere? And that's not good. So Yeah, I don't know how to formally compare that, but you know, in most of the places where we have worked, there are natural disasters already occurring, right? Of a different nature, but total depletion of resource bases, completely overfished fisheries, or populations, species populations that have completely crashed. And so, if it has to do with that sense of urgency, then maybe it's just endemic to the type of program. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna be really drunk.
Here, Chemonics, and my question had to do a bit with sustainability. And so for these behavior change campaigns, how long do you see the effects of these before either complacency or a need to adapt in a different way sets in? And then how have you been following up with those? Thank you.
So there are several ways to answer it. The first and most transparent is that there's virtually always regression if you're just talking about a 18 to 24 month behavior change campaign. So, and by regression I mean you see in your initial observations an increase in adoption of the new behavior, and then that dwindles over time. It doesn't sustain or increase. So, one thing is, certainly from our perspective, that's had an impact on our methodology in that we're very focused on training local partners in local organizations to build that capacity there, because RARE is almost definitely not going to be there long enough. And so the hope is that we're embedding the method a lot more, and that those local partners will continue to implement the actual campaigning. Because the more campaigning happens, the longer the results last. And we've seen this play out. We've supported campaigns for longer periods of time, but more often we see in the organizations that are continuing to do it at least a little bit, they're seeing a lot more maintenance of behavior change. Another element to the question is, it's a question of, and it kind of depends on the actual behaviors you're trying to promote. What level of diffusion do you need to reach within the resource use community, within the target audience, to actually sustain a new social norm? There's a lot of theory. It's so context specific. The further you get, the better you are. But I think there's generally a baseline. If you don't have more than a quarter of people doing something, I mean, it's so context specific. But there's a great example from this. I won't be able to cite it correctly, but one of the things that we do is try to not promote too many behaviors at a time, because I wish I could remember the citation, but there's a study from some agricultural program in Latin America. If anyone knows what this is, then they can help me. But there were I can't remember who's implementing the program. There were about 20 different agricultural practices that were being promoted within a community of farmers. And so I think it was about 80% of the farmers adopted at least one of those practices, but no more than, I think, something like 15% adopted any one in particular. And the idea behind, and then nobody was doing any of it anymore. And the idea behind that is that no single behavior was sufficiently diffused throughout the population to actually reach a new social norm. So everybody just went back to the way that they were doing things. So there's a lot of interesting theory coming out of the foundational theory is diffusion of innovations from Everett Rogers, which, if you're interested in this question, I mean, it's a seminal, timeless work, and it's spawned a whole ton of additional research. It was published in like the 60s, but is truly still timeless. That's a good place to start if you're actually interested in thinking more about it.
Allow some time for informal chat.
Thank you. Sorry to disappoint, it is not about mascots, but it's kind of building off of what you just talked about. And my name is Michelle Hunsberger, and I'm coming from Fenton. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your capacity building efforts and whether you're seeing local partners able to replicate this model once you're gone. And I know that part of that answer is, do they have the money, the funding to initiate these new campaigns? But I've been on other behavior change communication projects, and that aspect of capacity building and making sure that people can replicate that model once you're long gone is really hard to fulfill sometimes, and especially when donors want you to be extremely efficient with money, and that doesn't always allow you to spend a heck of a lot of time on each individual for the sake of efficiency. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on what your process is.
Yeah, so you know, I would say a couple of things. Yeah, agreed. Big challenge. You know, one of the things that we've learned over time and have changed as a result is earlier on we were focused much more on a specific individual in the partner organization and creating just a total rock star out of that individual, at the cost sometimes of not getting the buy-in across the whole organization. That person has supervisors, and so we've evolved a bit to incorporate more of the whole organization or other members of the organization to really try to embed that thinking in the organization. We also, you know, incorporate this sort of behavior change methodology into training about conservation resource management strategy more broadly, so that they're able to really link it to the organization's strategy. You know, we tend to be demand responsive, and so I mean, it's never this simple, but organizations generally ask to be capacitated, and so the demand is already there. Those are things, it's not, I mean, there are experiences all along the spectrum, but those are things that generally tend to help. And we have had great experiences. You know, I know of some organizations that they've taken some of the tools that we've trained one person in and spread them across entire global organizations. Some, you know, the person might be, the campaign manager might be just this awesome individual who's never able to get the buy-in, and you have both experiences.
That was very interesting. So a couple of final announcements and reminders or whatever. This will be on the Climate Links webpage, the slides and the audio and the video and photos. And then for the first time, it will be on livestream.com. From what I understand, we need to ask Kate for a card, which will have what could be a very long web address for where to go see it if you'd like to see it again, or recommend it to someone else. Don't come in November, because there won't be anything going on here. There'll be something going on, but not this. In December, we're going to meet on the 8th in this room, and it will be Chemonics, the Atlas Project, with Doug talking about
studies of economic costs of climate change. Sure, it'll be studies of economic costs of climate change centered around the study that we did in Indonesia.
And then in January, because of the inauguration, it will be on the 12th in this room again. And that'll be my colleague John Cook talking about some work he's done on ecosystem-based adaptation. Thank you very much. Have a cookie or a soda if you'd like.
And for these various dates and things, if you're on the Climate Links email distribution list, you'll get all that stuff. If you're not, you should go to Climate Links and sign up.